So welcome to Brown Bag History for December 8th, 2021. We're going to talk about the Farwell Police War today, which is always an interesting story. And as we start, going to the next slide, and we acknowledge the land, traditions, and culture of 4 nations: the Secwepemc, the Ktunaxa, the Sinixt, and the Okanagan Nation Alliance. We acknowledge our use and habitation of this land, sacred to these 4 nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. And now we're looking at a slide of A.S. Farwell. The whole story of the Farwell Police War goes back to, of course, when during railway construction days, and the town was known as Farwell. That was established by A.S. Farwell. And it was in the lower part of town on Front Street mostly, and in that region. And there was an ongoing conflict between A.S. Farwell and the CPR. And of course, that's enough for another whole story, which I have done before too. But the whole conflict essentially boiled down to issues of jurisdiction between the provincial and Dominion governments. And this dispute was never more evident than in the story of what became known as the Farwell Police War, which really was a jurisdictional dispute. So we're looking at a slide of the Rogers Pass during railway construction in 1885. And as you can imagine, liquor sales and drunkenness amongst the construction camp was a problem for the railway contractors. There was a man named George Hope Johnston, who was appointed by the province of British Columbia as Justice of the Peace for the Kootenay District in January of 1884. He was charged with the task of combating the illegal sale of imported and locally distilled liquor to railway construction crews. Later that year, he was appointed Commissioner of Police along the railway construction line through the Rockies and Selkirks, and we'll be hearing more about him later. Now he comes into the story. But despite these efforts, illegal alcohol sales continued to be a problem, and the CPR asked the federal government to police the mountain section of the railway route. Inspector Sam Steele of the Northwest Mounted Police was called upon to investigate the concerns of the railway company and found that it was largely a problem of interpretation of the law by federal and provincial officials. So the federal officials were enforcing a no liquor sales or consumption on the railway construction zones. And the provincial police were enforcing legal sales of alcohol if you had a legal license. So right away it was setting that up for a huge dispute. So mentioned Inspector Sam Steele. He was quite a remarkable figure in the history of the West. He was born in Upper Canada in 1849 to a father who was a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. Sam Steele entered Royal Military College, and in 1873, he was the 3rd officer sworn into the newly formed Northwest Mounted Police, entering as a staff constable. He's credited with calming an angry CPR construction crew at Beavermouth when they went on a riot after not receiving pay for 3 months. The story goes that he was seriously ill with Rocky Mountain spotted fever, but he came off of his sickbed to quell the near riot. It was said that simply through the force of his personality, he was able to restore order. So early in 1885, the Northwest Mounted Police Barracks was established at Farwell, just at the top of the Douglas Street Hill. Sam Steele was the officer in command, and they policed from Farwell and points east through the mountains. And in this photograph, Sam Steele is the man sitting in the front of the photograph with the white helmet. Of course, there were no Revelstoke or Farwell newspapers at that time, but Farwell News was regularly reported in the Daily Colonist newspaper out of Victoria. There was a couple of reports that gave a bit of a sense of the state of affairs in the construction town. In April 7th, 1885, the Daily Colonist reported Farwell already is 3 or 4 times as large as Kamloops. The great want here is a resident magistrate. That is what everyone expects. The corporal and 3 men of the mounted police have a barracks, cells, and stable on the edge of the rise south of the streets. 2 weeks later, the report from Farwell in the April 22nd issue spoke of the need for policing of liquor sales. The town of Farwell is growing and composed partly of a rough class. There are probably 20 bars in the town selling spirits openly without a shadow of a license. When the stipendiary magistrate, who is A.W. Vowell from Kootenay, makes his visit here, all the glasses and decanters are removed and no whiskey selling apparently goes on. Half an hour after his back is turned, the trade opens up in full blast. Nothing will stop it but the permanent residence of a magistrate at that point. The daily colonists continued to decry the lack of provincial policing at Farwell, especially after Sam Steele and the other Dominion officers were called east to join Dominion forces to deal with the Riel Rebellion. The correspondents to the newspaper expressed concern over the lawlessness in the region, as well as the fact that considerable provincial revenue was being lost due to the unlicensed liquor sales. That was probably the biggest concern, losing all the liquor revenue. Finally, at the end of April of 1885, John Kirkup, known as Big Jack, was appointed as chief constable by the province. Kirkup was another outstanding BC pioneer in more ways than one. He stood 6'3" tall, which was an unusual height for that era. Kirkup was born in Ontario in 1855 and came to British Columbia in 1877, where he joined the Victoria Police. He became a provincial police officer in 1881 and worked out of Yale as a police officer during railway construction. When he arrived in Farwell, he already had a reputation as a fair but no-nonsense police officer. At one point in his career, he was pursuing a criminal south of the border and was joined by famed frontier artist Frederick Remington, whose sketches of Kirkup were published in Harper's Magazine in 1891. A pioneer resident, Sarah Dickey, recalled that on her first morning in Revelstoke in 1886, she looked out the window to see Kirkup crossing the street with a drunken man under each arm. So he was really seen, a good man for a frontier town like Farwell was back then. A little side note, when Sarah Dickey came to join her husband, William, they were originally living on Front Street, but they later built their house right where the museum is standing now. In 1899, it was later moved for the building of the post office. Along with Kirkup, Gilbert Malcolm Sproat arrived in Revelstoke as the stipendiary magistrate. He was born in Scotland in 1834 and came to Vancouver Island in 1860, where he started the first sawmill at Port Alberni. In 1863, he was made Justice of the Peace for the colony of Vancouver Island and later served as an appointee on the Indian Reserve Commission. He held several regional offices in the Kootenays from 1883 onward, including that of stipendiary magistrate here at Revelstoke from 1885 to 1889. He was also instrumental in establishing the community of Nelson. The interesting thing about Sproat is that he was a business partner with A.S. Farwell. And I think there was definitely some conflict of interest going on there because he was actually acting on Farwell's behalf in a lot of cases, even while he was trying to mitigate some of the disputes over ownership in the Farwell area. So it was, I don't think there's any question that it was a blatant conflict of interest. And he was also hearing cases involving Farwell's land grant and Farwell's attempt to sell land in the disputed town site. When Sam Steele left for the Riel Rebellion, he put George Hope Johnston in charge at Farwell. Remember, I'd mentioned earlier that George Johnston had been appointed as a provincial magistrate in the Kootenays. But neither Johnston nor the constables were regular officers of the Dominion Police Force, and none of them had been through any kind of police training. And Johnston was quite young. He was still in his late 20s at that time. The Dominion officers were enforcing the federal law against selling alcohol in the railway belt, whereas Sproat and Kirkup were working under provincial regulations, which allowed the issuing of licenses to people wishing to sell liquor, particularly if they had an established building, like a saloon or a hotel. And Kirkup and Sproat, the provincial police, would arrest and charge only unlicensed liquor sellers. And Sproat and Kirkup had their work cut out for them, because reports in the summer of 1885 continued to claim that the vast majority of saloons operating in Farwell were unlicensed. There were also claims that the steamboat SS Kootenai, which is the front boat of these three, were bringing liquor and cigars up the Columbia River from the United States, along with legitimate supplies for railway construction as well. One story tells of a man named Jack Enright, originally from Montana, who had a saloon on Front Street. Enright would take a rowboat a few miles south of town to pick up his supplies. The spot where he met the SS Kootenai became known as Montana Creek, Montana Slough. That's supposedly where that name came from. After delivering the illegal goods to Enright, the SS Kootenai would continue its trip up to Farwell with its legal cargo of railway supplies. And that's, I can't confirm that, but that's that's what we believe that the name Montana Slough, Montana Creek came from. The Daily Colonist from Victoria in June 5th of 1885 had a report of some of the goings on here. It said a stabbing scrape occurred in a dance house on last Wednesday night, but no one was killed. 5 arrests were made, and Mr. Sproat, stipendiary magistrate, committed the culprits to jail, which is a log hut. The Wagon Road Bridge, which is to run beneath the railway bridge, will be ready for use in 10 days' time. Since Mr. Sproat's arrival, the people are more orderly and arouse are less frequent. The Columbia River steamboat is rushing in liquors and cigars from the American side, on which there is no attempt made to collect duties. By the middle of June 1885, the Farwell Police War began to heat up, and the tensions between the two police factions started to become apparent. George Hope Johnston of the Dominion Force of the Northwest Mounted Police was issuing summons to appear to several licensed hotel owners. And he had one of his special officers seize liquor from a hotelier named John McGillis, who had a license. And they placed the liquor in the barracks. McGillis was outraged and went to Sproat, who swore out a warrant against the Dominion officers for removing the liquor. Officer Kirkup went to the barracks and demanded the liquor back. When the special constable refused, Kirkup broke down the door, seized the liquor, and summoned the special constable to appear before Sproat. The special constable failed to appear before Sproat, and it was discovered that he'd left town. Another note in the Victoria Daily Colonist on June 19th, 1885, under the pen name of Columbia, a writer was referring to Johnston and his constables as Cossacks. He said, it's a very appropriate term, for they do most outrageous acts. They summoned a hotel keeper named Hanson under a search warrant issued on an information in May, 85 miles east distant, sworn to at Beaver City. All the liquor cases before Johnson since Mr. Sproat arrived have been appealed. Johnson's search warrants are like bank circular notes, good anywhere. Sir Matthew Bailey Begbie, who is the Chief Justice of British Columbia, presided over sittings of assize and county courts in Revelstoke on June 24th and 25th, 1885. Most of the cases involved appeals from convictions in liquor selling cases. The Daily Colonist of July 3rd, 1885 reported on the court sitting that the appeals from convictions by Mr. Johnston, JP, were held over for consideration as they involve grave constitutional questions. The Dominion Police are the chief disturbers of peace of this district, but for their partial, irregular, and oppressive proceedings, Everything would go on quietly in the old British Columbia fashion and with a better result for all concerned. And then in what seems a spectacularly blatant case of conflict of interest, A.S. Farwell was appointed foreman of the grand jury at the court sessions presided over by Begbie, and he was hearing cases regarding his own land, as well as the liquor licensing cases. And Farwell himself wrote in the July 4th, 1885 issue of the Daily Colonist, "The action taken in consequence of the differences between the Dominion and provincial governments with respect to the right of issuing liquor licenses has inflicted the greatest hardship and loss upon many respectable licensed hotel keepers and traders in an important branch of their general business, and has curtailed the trade of the province." As summer wore on, reports of the differing policing practices of the Dominion and provincial governments continued to be reported in the Daily Colonist. In the beautifully florid writing style of the day, this headline appeared in the July 25th issue. "Letter from Farwell. Official robberies continue. Shameful treatment of the holders of provincial licenses. Illegal fines remitted to Canada. Story of McGillison Hills liquor stopped at Eagle Pass. Well, liquor was allowed to go to a hotel at Eagle Pass Landing." That was the headline of the article. The article went on to say, "The other day, one of Johnston's special officers seized John McGillie's stock of liquors and placed him in the barracks. McGillie's consulted Mr. Sproat, and a warrant was sworn out against the specials for removing the liquor." And then this was that case where the constable had failed to appear. It said, "It was discovered that he had gone east, where it is hoped he will wisely remain." The article went on to refer to the Dominion Police Force as the Northwest Territory Brigands, and gave another account of the arbitrary policing by the Dominion officers. So the whole mounted police business in British Columbia is a farce as far as carrying out the Dominion Act is concerned. In Beaver City last winter, there were over 40 saloons running openly under the noses of Captain Steele and his men and doing a good business. Steele hauled them up occasionally and fined them $20 in costs, remitting the fines, etc., it is presumed, to Canada. The practical working of the whole matter is liquor sellers pay in fines just about the amount of the provincial licenses. The difference being the Dominion officers are making money for Canada, and the population are hunted around like wild beasts. And wild beasts was in capital letters for emphasis. British Columbia has hitherto managed its own affairs well and maintained peace and order without difficulty. Onderdonk, who was the contractor on the western end of the construction from Yale to Craigellachie, said Onderdonk carried on his work without the mounted police, but for some reason or other, this poor district is handed over to a horde of semi-official robbers. So there was definitely not a lot of love for the Dominion police. Although the feelings were very strong against the Dominion policing, the provincial police were not considered blameless, and it became obvious that the collusion between A.S. Farwell and Gilbert Malcolm Sproat was also causing problems for the early settlers. Community indignation meetings were held that summer to protest against the refusal of Sproat and Kirkup to issue trade licenses to residents until they had paid Farwell for their lots. And people couldn't get clear title to their property because of the whole dispute between the federal and Dominion government over the issuing of land here. So Farwell basically had Sproat not issuing licenses until they had paid Farwell. So it was pretty blatant. Some settlers claimed that they had already paid previous landholders for their lots, only to be informed that they also had to pay Farwell. There was even a suggestion made that the residents raise a fund to bribe a certain magistrate to leave the saloon keepers alone on the ground that the license system was a farce. And that was reported also in the Calgary Herald of August 11th, 1885. And there definitely were reports in both the Calgary paper and the Victoria paper. And one of the Victorian newspapers said that anything coming out of the Calgary Herald about Farwell is absolute rot. So there was dispute between even the newspapers too. The Victoria paper in August 15th, 1885, had an article called "The Prohibition Law on the CPR, How the Working of the Act is Negatived by the Dishonesty of the Administration." And it said, no person who has traveled along the course of the CPR can fail to realize that the prohibition of the sale of liquor with the 20 miles limit as prescribed by the law has proved a miserable failure. Designed as the statute was to keep in check the many forms of vice, it has, between the contending civil authorities and the dishonest administration, become a byword in the land. The conflict between the two forces came to a head in September of 1885, when a Dominion constable from the Northwest Mounted Police Barracks was brought before Provincial Magistrate Sproat on a charge of larceny by illegally apprehending liquor from a provincially licensed cellar. Sproat adjourned the hearing so that George Hope Johnston, who was in charge at the federal barracks, could appear as a witness and assist the accused. He agreed to let the constable out on a small bail, but before he could grant bail, the Dominion constable simply walked out of the log provincial courthouse and returned to the Northwest Mounted Police Barracks at the top of the hill. So then Sproat sent two special provincial constables to bring the prisoner back. But upon arriving at the barracks, they were set upon by Johnston and 5 or 6 others at the barracks. One of the provincial constables was knocked down, dragged inside the barracks, and after what was referred to in the newspapers as a burlesque trial, was sentenced to 14 days hard labor. The other constable was also assaulted, but managed to escape and immediately reported back to Sproat. So Sproat then placed a warrant for the bail jumping Dominion constable in the hands of John Miles, who was a regular provincial constable. But he advised him to wait for a few days to execute the warrant in the hope that the animosity would die down a bit. But the day after, a group of special constables from the Northwest Mounted Police Barracks, including the escaped Dominion constable, marched down the street with revolvers. John Miles presented the warrant, at which point all of the Dominion officers surrounded him, handcuffed him, and dragged him to the barracks where he was put into a cell. The warrant and its copy were taken from him and torn up. Sproat obviously was outraged by the way his constables were being treated, and he made arrangements to storm the barracks the next morning and rescue them. This is where the newspaper accounts of the event get very confusing and contradictory, but it appears that the provincial police force went to the barracks where they captured Johnston and his chief of police and took them to the provincial prison. Johnston requested that Sheriff Kirkup send a provincial constable with something that he required. And when the constable arrived, he was captured and thrown into the Dominion cell in the Northwest Mounted Police Barracks with Miles Johnston, or with John Miles. Johnston finally agreed to free the provincial constables, and he was released on bail. At one point, there was a rumor that the remaining Dominion officers were making plans to storm the provincial jail. And although the claims were made in a saloon, and most probably under the influence of alcohol, Sproat and Kirkup mounted extra guards at the jail. The rumored raid didn't happen. And before Sproat could arrest the remaining Dominion officers, most of them had fled Farwell. Johnston's chief of police, who had been arrested with him, jumped bail and also left town, leaving Johnston alone to face the consequences. It was felt that his relative youth and his inexperience made him unfit to control a force of untrained constables. So the thing kind of, at this point, kind of blew over. Most of the Dominion constables had left by then. The October 3rd, 1885 issue of the Daily Colonist reported on the conclusion of the fair. Colonel J.F. McLeod, that Fort McLeod is named after, who is the former commander of the Mounted Police in the region and judge of the region south of Calgary, was sent to Farwell by the Dominion government to determine who was to blame in the affair and to reach an agreement with Sproat over local policing. Johnston and the other officers who were apprehended all changed their pleas to guilty, but they were dealt with leniently, and it sounds as though none of them received any further jail time. Colonel MacLeod and GM Sproat agreed upon a plan for joint policing, and Johnston and the other officers were disciplined and released. Sam Steele returned to assume control of the Northwest Mounted Police barracks in Farwell, and he remained there until 1886, when he was transferred to the booming mining area in East Kootenay. Fort Steele, near Cranbrook, is named after him. Steele went on to command both the Lord Strathcona's Horse and the South Africa Constabulary during the Boer War. And he also served, even though he was elderly in the 60s by that time, he was an officer in World War I as well. Johnston became a successful rancher in the Calgary area and later served as a sheriff in Calgary. And Kirkup and Sproat continued to keep the law here in terms of the provincial law. When put the chapter on this in my first brown bag history book, we had the famous Rob Buchanan do a cartoon about it. So brigands and bail jumpers. If you ask me, I'd say the whole lot of them could use a wee dram of brotherly love. So it's such a classic story. You know, it really really illustrates that whole dispute between the federal and provincial government. And you really get an idea of, you know, how the kind of, because British Columbia had been independent for so long without any real physical connection to the east, and that was what the railway was supposed to solve, was that whole problem of British Columbia being separated from the rest of Canada. But you can really see how it plays out in a case like this, that real distrust and dislike of the federal government, which continues even today. But it's a great story, and I love telling this one. It probably is based on him. So I'm just going to show a couple of fun pictures here. Yesterday, the Kelowna Museum started something called a museum snowball fight Facebook challenge. So they posted a couple of snow pictures, and then they challenged a couple of other museums. And the sorry, I can't pronounce the name, but there's an Indigenous museum in West Kelowna. And one of our former employees, Diani Mostert, works there. So she tagged our museum in the challenge. And of course, being in Revelstoke, it's pretty hard to find just one good snow picture. So we chose a couple. The one on this side is a dog at Glacier, BC, probably in about the 1930s. The dog's name was Snowboy, beautiful St. Bernard, and he's with a member of the Southworth family here. We also have another picture of the same dog from the McKinnon Fond, or McKinnon collection, because Mary McKinnon was a school teacher there as well. And so there's the one dog appears in two different family collections. So we had to put Snowboy in, because he's such a good boy. And then we also, probably the biggest snowman ever built in Revelstoke from 1915 at the first Winter Sports Carnival, February 1915. And you see what he's holding there is a torch, and they actually lit the torch. I think they had the snowman wired, so they were actually able to light it. So that's a pretty epic snowman. Also want to mention that next week we are having our annual Brown Bag Christmas party. So if any of you plan to attend, just let us know. And then we'll do a short Zoom presentation with probably a few fun photos and fun stories at 12:30. So thank you for joining us today. And we'll see you again.